It all started with what he called a joke, one that left me reeling. He laughed and said maybe I should start competing for his attention, just like his female friends did. And he had the nerve to say that while I was the one paying his rent. That was the moment something in me snapped. I turned around, walked out, and let him deal with the fallout on his own. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and for the last 4 years I've been in what I believed was a stable, loving relationship. We never really had any serious arguments or dramatic fallouts. Not once did we break up or even take a break. We met in a university workshop, one of those optional sessions offered for extra credit. He asked me out for a coffee afterward, and things just flowed naturally from there. We clicked. You'd think after 4 years we'd have weathered the usual storms that come with a long-term relationship, but honestly, it was pretty smooth sailing. Until it wasn't. In the beginning, we both had decent jobs lined up straight after graduation. We were in that honeymoon phase of post-college life, each making our own money, dreaming of building something together. Then, about 2 years in, he told me he wanted to chase his passion, something in independent media. He'd always had this dream of creating content, starting his own channel, and building a brand from the ground up. And I supported him. I genuinely wanted him to find joy and fulfillment in his work, even if that meant stepping into the unknown. At first I wasn't worried. He had savings, and he'd secured a small sponsorship to get started. He was excited, and so was I. But it quickly became clear that his plan needed more time and a lot more money than he'd anticipated. His savings dried up, and every penny from his sponsors went straight into his startup. Eventually, the reality hit hard. He couldn't cover his rent, not just for 1 month, but when he finally admitted how bad things were, I didn't hesitate. I told him not to worry about the financial side of things, that I'd help him until his venture turned a profit. Moving in with me wasn't really feasible. He had converted his apartment into his workspace, and he didn't want to rent out an office. So, I started paying his rent, fully believing it was a temporary situation. And for a while, I was okay with that. But recently, something shifted. He became distant. His work hours stretched longer and longer, and our communication grew sparse. Sometimes we'd go an entire week without speaking, texting, or seeing each other. I get that starting a business is demanding, and I respected his dedication. Still, it felt like our relationship had taken a back seat. Last Saturday, I decided to surprise him. I left work early, hoping to drag him away from his desk for a bit of fresh air and quality time. When I got to his apartment, one of his friends, also a coworker, answered the door. Her expression when she saw me was far from welcoming. That moment set the tone for what would be a deeply unsettling visit. Inside, I found my boyfriend hunched over his laptop, surrounded by a few of his friends, turned freelancers. When I asked if he could wrap up for the day so we could spend some time together, especially since we hadn't seen each other in nearly a week, he said he needed about 30 minutes. I thought that was fair, so I waited, figuring we'd go for a walk or grab a bite once he was done. But just as he was getting ready to leave, that same female friend from earlier walked up to him. She teasingly asked where he thought he was going. He said he was heading out with me, but she laughed and said that as the boss, he should be setting an example and staying just as late as the rest of them. It was all said in a joking manner, but the next thing I knew, he agreed. He said something like, "If you want me to stay that bad, maybe I should." I stood there, stunned. He didn't even look at me to gauge my reaction. Just like that, I was sidelined. I tried to keep my composure. I reminded him gently that we hadn't had any time together lately, and since he was done with work, we should enjoy the evening. But instead of hearing me out, he smirked and said something that shattered me. "Maybe you should start competing for my attention like they do." I could tell he meant it as a joke. Maybe in another context, on another day, I'd have laughed. But not this time. Not after carrying so much of his financial burden. Not after being pushed aside while I worked long hours just to keep a roof over his head. So I picked up my bag, looked him straight in the eye, and said he could enjoy the company of his friends while I went and enjoyed my own life, the one I worked hard for. I left, hoping he'd follow me, or at least call me right away. But all I got was a cold text hours later. He told me I was rude and disrespectful for storming out in front of his friends. No mention of how he had treated me, no acknowledgement of my feelings, nothing. That was when it really hit me. I had been bending over backwards for a man who didn't even see me as a priority. I wasn't just his girlfriend. I had become his financial crutch, his emotional support system. And still, he put me last. So I made a decision. I called his landlord and told him I wouldn't be paying the rent anymore. I said he was free to remove my name from any records, and that he should contact the tenant directly going forward. To be honest, I didn't expect immediate consequences. But the next day my boyfriend messaged me, panicked. He asked why I hadn't paid the rent, and said the landlord had shown up with an eviction notice. There was no apology, no remorse, just anger and confusion over his sudden crisis. After the confrontation at his apartment, he called me multiple times, but I refused to answer. I didn't want to hear more excuses or be manipulated into a conversation that would lead nowhere. I ignored every call, dismissed every text, and eventually blocked him from every possible platform. He might have wanted me to get dragged into one of his mind games again, perhaps hoping I'd chase after him, desperate for his attention. But I chose not to. I let him and his adoring little audience win while I stepped away entirely from the chaos. Judging by the barrage of missed calls and messages that flooded my phone in just a few hours, it became painfully obvious his carefully constructed world was collapsing. Without me propping him up, his financial and emotional scaffolding crumbled. He had depended on me far more than either of us had acknowledged, and he clearly never anticipated how quickly I'd walk away once I became emotionally detached. He underestimated me. He thought I'd always be there, no matter how carelessly he treated me. Of course, cutting him off hasn't been emotionally easy. There's a deep mental toll that comes from walking away from someone you've invested years into, emotionally, financially, even spiritually. Now that everything is said and done, I found myself lying awake at night, questioning the decisions I made. Things summoned me. Did I go too far? Could I have handled things differently? Maybe we could have sat down and talked like two mature adults, but every time I revisit that thought, I remember how smug and dismissive he was the last time I saw him. How he told me to compete for his attention like I was nothing more than a side character in his life. That memory burns, and it keeps me grounded in my decision. Still, I wanted an outside perspective. Am I the one who ruined his life and career by pulling the plug? Or is he the one who pushed me to the edge with his lack of gratitude, his immaturity, and the subtle erosion of my dignity over time? Then came the moment that truly peeled back the mask. I've always heard people say that a person's true nature comes out when they're under pressure, when life gets hard and the facade can no longer hold. And let me tell you, I saw his true colors, unill-filtered and terrifying. After a week of silence from my end, he showed up at my apartment late at night. I hadn't responded to anything, not one call, not one text. I wasn't ready to hear his voice or to face more guilt-tripping. I had my door's security chain on, so when I cracked it open to see who was there, he immediately tried to force his way inside. I slammed it shut before he could break through, leaving the chain securely in place. He was shouting, demanding to know why I had stopped paying his rent without warning him first and why I was acting like a child. The irony in being labeled immature by someone who had resorted to brute force rather than conversation was not lost on me. I stayed calm, despite the fear crawling up my spine. I told him I owed him no explanation. He was the one who publicly minimized me, asked me to compete for his attention, and now he could live with the consequences of that disrespect. I reminded him that I had supported him through the toughest phase of his life, that I had paid his bills and championed his dreams, and how did he repay me? By treating me like a background character in his own ego-driven narrative. His eyes went wild with anger. He lunged toward the door again, reaching for me with what I could only describe as violent intent. I stepped back and slammed the door, locking it fully this time. He continued pounding on the door for 15 minutes. It was relentless. Finally, I screamed through the door that I had called 911. That got him to back off, but it left me shaken to my core. In all our years together, I had never seen that side of him. I realized in that moment that I didn't really know him, not entirely, and that unknown was terrifying. Sadly, that wasn't the end. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice something deeply unsettling. Wherever I went, he was there, not directly confronting me, but lurking in the background. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, but then it happened again and again. Every time I left my apartment or got off work, I would spot him nearby, at a cafe, across the street, loitering in a park near my home. It was no longer paranoia, it was a pattern. I called a few of my closest friends and asked for their help. They started accompanying me to work and back, keeping a lookout. One day, we confirmed it. He was following me from my apartment to my workplace, waiting nearby until my shift ended and trailing me back home. He wasn't just stalking me, he was tracking my daily life, shadowing me like a predator. I decided to confront him, but I didn't go alone. I met him in a public place, with friends nearby just in case. When I approached him, I expected a confrontation, possibly even more threats, but instead, he broke down in tears. He begged me to take him back, said he was sorry, that he hadn't realized how much I meant to him until I left. He admitted that he had taken me for granted, that he now understood I was the only woman he ever truly loved. In another lifetime, those words might have swayed me, but not now, not after the stalking, not after the forced entry attempt. His behavior had crossed so many lines that his apology felt hollow and manipulative. I told him that I had moved on, that what he was doing was making me feel unsafe, and that if he didn't stop, I would file a police report. That warning didn't deter him. Eventually, I had no choice. I filed for a restraining order. The process was long, emotionally draining, and incredibly stressful, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself. The final straw came when he once again tried to corner me in public, urging me to come back to him. Luckily, a friend who was with me at the time called the police, and they arrived quickly enough to arrest him. I followed through with my request for a restraining order, and, after presenting evidence, it was granted. I'm also planning to move into a new apartment, one that he won't know the address of. I'm doing everything I can to reclaim my safety and peace of mind. I wanted to share this update because so many people had reached out with concern. For now, I'm okay. He's out on bail, but he hasn't come near me since. I remain vigilant, but I'm hopeful that the message is finally getting through to him. There's something people often say to younger folks when they're going through rough times. You're still young, don't waste your energy on people who don't deserve it. And I can't emphasize enough how true that is. Looking back, it's clear to me now. I wasn't the villain in this story. The boyfriend needed a wake-up call, and if that had to come in the form of losing me, then so be it. Sure, maybe I enabled him for too long by footing his bills and letting him assume that being in a relationship meant he could act however he pleased. But better to come to your senses late than never, right? And as I was processing all of that, another storm was brewing. My own drama of the week. I'm 16 years old, and last weekend I ended up getting kicked out of Sunday school at my stepdad's church. My mom married Brad earlier this year, and let me tell you, his family lives and breathes religion. Brad has 4 kids, a 12-year-old daughter and 3 younger boys aged 10, 9, and 7. These kids are at his house. Saying they're religious is putting it lightly. His daughter can't cut her hair or wear anything other than skirts, and the whole family is at church at least 3 times every single week. They also have mandatory family Bible study sessions every evening. That's the norm in Brad's household, and to each their own, but it only became a problem for me when they started insisting I had to participate too. Now, let's get one thing straight. I'm not religious. In fact, I find a lot of what they preach deeply uncomfortable, superstitious, outdated, and honestly, misogynistic. I try not to cause conflict, but every time I leave that church I feel gross. I've asked my mom if I could just spend Sundays at my dad's house to avoid these confrontations, but she won't even consider it. So I keep my head down and try to stay out of the way, even though Brad seems to have made it his life's mission to convert me. I finally reached a breaking point. After a heated argument, I told my mom I didn't want to go to church anymore. She begged me, said it would keep the peace for the younger kids if I just showed up and sat quietly. Wanting to avoid more conflict, I gave in and agreed to go, but I wasn't going to pretend to be something I wasn't. I brought a book, kept to myself, and if anyone asked me about my beliefs, I answered honestly. That honesty drove both Brad and my mom up the wall. The real kicker came during Sunday school. The teacher for the teenage group is a condescending man who talks to us like we're incapable of original thought. He loves diving into biblical Greek and showing off his so-called knowledge, but the problem is, he's almost always completely wrong. You see, I go to a private school, and I've spent 2 years studying ancient Greek. I'm currently taking Latin. I can read the texts he references, and I know when he's bluffing. So this time, I decided to bring an interlinear New Testament and a Koine Greek dictionary with me. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, I just wanted to understand what he was saying and see if there was any truth to it. When he started misinterpreting the Greek again, I gently pointed out that my sources said something different. I asked for clarification, said things like, "That's interesting, because my text translates this verse a different way." It wasn't hostile, just curious. But, as you can probably guess, he didn't take it well. His face turned beet red as I politely, but persistently, questioned his interpretations. I guess he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenage girl. Eventually, he asked me to stop interrupting the class. I just shrugged and said I was trying to learn. The next thing I knew, he ran to the pastor, who then went to Brad. The verdict? I was banned from Sunday school. Apparently, I was being disrespectful. Now Brad and my mom are furious. They're demanding that I apologize for derailing the class. But I don't see why I should. I was asking questions and engaging with the material. Shouldn't that be encouraged in any learning environment? Fast forward to today. I'm officially living full-time with my dad. My mom is still seething, but she's going to have to deal with it. Right now, I only visit her house for a few hours on weekends, and that's only if it's absolutely necessary. Brad isn't allowed to contact me anymore, and honestly, that's a relief. One bright spot in all of this is my stepsister. When I visited for Christmas to exchange presents, I secretly left her a note along with a gift. In the note, I told her that if she ever needed someone to talk to or needed help, she could text me. She did. She thanked me and promised she wouldn't tell anyone. Since then, we've been texting occasionally. It gives me peace knowing that if things ever get too intense for her in that house, she has a way to reach out. She'll be old enough to seek emancipation by the time I finish college, and if she wants to leave, I've already told her I'd help her figure something out. Maybe even a roommate situation. Let me be clear, Brad is way out of line trying to shove his beliefs down my throat. My mom is also wrong for pressuring me to conform just to keep the peace. What they both fail to understand is that respect is a two-way street. They expect me to respect their faith while simultaneously ignoring my right to have my own beliefs. It's infuriating how the adults in my life have completely disregarded my autonomy, especially in matters as personal as religion. If the Sunday school teacher was genuinely interested in learning, he would have welcomed the discussion. But the moment I brought facts and critical thinking into the room, it became clear that education wasn't the goal either. Submission was. Late one night, well past midnight, I was woken by the sound of my phone buzzing insistently. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just a wrong number or some spam call. But the same number kept calling back, again and again. After the fifth attempt, I finally picked up, bleary-eyed and confused. On the other end of the line was a voice I recognized almost immediately, though it was distorted by tears and alcohol. It was my son's ex-girlfriend. She was crying uncontrollably, her words slurring into one another, her voice frantic and incoherent. She kept saying things about her mother, about something being wrong, but none of it made much sense. What was clear, though, was that she was in a fragile state, frightened, disoriented, and desperately in need of help. Despite the late hour and the unusual circumstances, my parental instincts kicked in. I soothed her gently over the phone and asked if she needed a safe place to stay. She hesitated for a moment before asking if she could come over and stay in our guest room for the night. Without hesitation, I told her she could stay as long as she needed. She needed support more than anything at that moment, and I wasn't about to turn her away. When she arrived, she was clearly embarrassed. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she kept apologizing, saying she didn't want to cause trouble. My wife helped her get settled into the guest room, made her some tea, and assured her she was welcome. We let her rest for the night, checking in briefly to make sure she was okay before giving her space. The next morning, we decided to include her in breakfast. We figured she could use some normalcy, and we didn't want her to feel like a burden. She was reserved, clearly still embarrassed, but we did our best to make her feel comfortable. Then, my son walked into the kitchen. The moment he saw her sitting at the breakfast table, his face froze. His expression was a mix of shock, confusion, and something deeper: hurt, maybe even betrayal. He didn't say anything at first, just turned and made as if to leave. I gently encouraged him to stay, hoping we could all sit down together, maybe even clear the air a little. He hesitated, but eventually sat, though the tension at the table was thick and awkward. Despite the strained atmosphere, there were still signs, flickers in their eyes, brief moments of softened glances that suggested feelings lingered between them. I seen the way they looked at each other, and whatever broke them apart clearly hadn't erased everything. But the breakfast was short-lived. She cut it home, murmuring that her parents would be worried and that she should head home. My son offered to drive her, but she politely declined and left on her own. As soon as she walked out the door, my son's emotions erupted. He confronted both me and my wife, visibly upset, demanding to know why we had allowed her to stay the night, why we didn't think to at least give him a heads up. His voice trembled with frustration as he told us we had invaded a deeply personal and sensitive part of his life. He accused us of showing no respect for his emotional boundaries and said that we should have warned him that she would be there in the morning. I stood there, trying to explain that we were just trying to help someone in need, that it wasn't about disregarding his feelings but responding to a young woman who clearly had no one else to turn to in that moment. But he wasn't hearing it. To him, we had blindsided him, ambushed him with something he wasn't prepared to deal with emotionally. He told us, in no uncertain terms, that while he understood the instinct to help, we should have at least knocked on his door, sent him a text, something, anything, to give him the choice to stay in his room if he wasn't ready to face her. Reflecting on it now, I understand. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do, offering someone in crisis a safe place. But we didn't stop to consider the impact it would have on our son, especially without context or preparation. He was blindsided at the breakfast table, ambushed by his own past. In hindsight, maybe offering her the guest room wasn't the issue. It was offering her an open-ended stay, suggesting she could remain as long as she liked, without ever checking in with the one person in the house most affected by her presence. That was a mistake, a serious one. Many have asked, how could we not see the obvious emotional minefield we were stepping into? Did we forget what it feels like to be young and heartbroken, to see someone who once meant the world to you sitting at your table like nothing ever happened? Helping her in that moment of crisis wasn't wrong, but failing to inform, consult, or even consider our son's feelings was. No matter how kind or intelligent she may be, no matter how close we had become with her during the time they were dating, she was still his ex. And that label carries a weight we didn't respect when we chose to include her without warning him. And yes, as people pointed out to us repeatedly, we have our own pasts. We've dated people before each other. How would we feel if one of our exes was sitting in our kitchen out of the blue one morning? Would we have been calm? Probably not. It was inconsiderate, and despite our good intentions, we hurt our son in a place where he should have felt the most secure, his own home. So to answer the question I kept turning over in my mind, was I the a-hole for letting her stay, for inviting her to breakfast, and for not telling him? Looking at it now, yes. Not because I tried to help someone, but because I did it without enough thought for the emotional fallout it would cause. My wife and I have both apologized to our son, sincerely. We sat down and explained everything. Why we did what we did, where our minds were at, and how much we regret not giving him the consideration he deserved. We told him it wouldn't happen again. That we learned something about boundaries and how crucial they are, even in your own home. We're working on rebuilding that trust now. It's not easy, but we're committed. Because while you can't always control the situations life throws at you, you can control how much care and respect you show the people closest to you.